Good morning. Welcome to Bible study. We're pleased that you could be with us. Pastor Scott and I welcome Paul Nuechterlein today to be with us. We find ourselves in the sermon series, Faithfully Waiting. And so I will turn this over to Pastor Scott, who will read the scripture for us.
Today we're looking at Matthew 25, 14 to 30, the parable of the talents that you may know it as. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Thank you. This is one of those times where we say the gospel of our Lord, and the response is, thanks be to God. And really? Is that what we mean to say?
The gospel?
Exactly. This is the good news. Matthew has a habit of that. In fact, in the past month, we've had 3 parables in Matthew. One was the parable of the wedding banquet, where the person who didn't wear the wedding robe was thrown out of the banquet. We had last week's where it was the 10 bridesmaids, and the foolish bridesmaids didn't bring enough oil, and so the door was locked, and the bridegroom says, I don't know who you are, and cast them aside. And now we come to this parable, and this parable is also talking about judgment and casting aside. And so that's hard for us to understand. I think we need to think a little bit about Matthew and who Matthew is writing to, who his audience is. And Matthew's writing to the Jewish people, basically to convince them that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And the Jewish people would have had in their history this idea of judgment to motivate them. So, it would be that they would be given a piece or told that if you don't do this, the 10 Commandments. Jesus said, or God said, there will be blessings and there will be curses. Blessings if you follow them, curses if you don't. So they're used to the idea of having some kind of judgment that would motivate them to do what's right. And so I think that's the mindset we have to have for when we read Matthew, is that kind of mindset. It's hard for us, though, because we don't like reading these.
Yeah.
They are very judgmental.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to cue that up a little bit. Anything, Paul or Scott, that you read in here that intrigued you, that you'd like to open up with?
Well, let me say that this is one of those texts that I started out disliking. It annoyed me. And but my past experience is that if I start out disliking it, sometimes I end up learning more from it.
Yes. It's that sense of having to dig deeper, because if I don't like it, I need to find out what this parable is about. I need to find out what Jesus is talking about here.
It takes time.
Yes, yes.
And I began with defining talent. You know, I think the Greek word is something along the lines of talenta, and we've translated that in English talent, and we know what we think of as a talent, something that we're good at inherently, you know, maybe physically or mentally good at. But a talent in this parable is a gift, a resource, money in this case. So it is still being entrusted with some type of gift, but not specifically a physical or mental ability kind of gift. So I kind of began with defining talent there. And then, so again, for the gospel today, that means something given by God that is meant to be used and not buried.
Exactly.
Right? And if you can kind of begin to get your head around that, you at least move it from the realm of annoying, frustrating, something that we dislike, a parable that we dislike, into something that, there is a deeper meaning to it, and we need to get down to that. So.
I think we move immediately to the end, too. I want to point this out, as I always want to point this out, is that the master, the owner, gave to each of them. He entrusted to each of them. So the beginning of the parable, it doesn't separate them. They are trustworthy according to the master, because he gives each of them the talents. Right. And so there's no distinction there. And I want to point that out, because we usually get to the end of the parable where there is a distinction, and we immediately say that it was the master that did it, but from the beginning it's not a distinction. They're all given talents.
Right. And you know, one note that I read was the one who was given one talent, that talent would have been worth about 15 years' wages. So even if the master delegated how many talents differently, even the one talent would have been equivalent to more money than any servant would have been able to fathom in his lifetime. So it was still a massive gift to be entrusted with.
Well, you know, that leads me to wonder why the one-talent servant, when he was confronted by the master and became defensive, why would he accuse the master of being a jerk? The master doesn't come across as a jerk in the story.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, this is just totally unreasonable.
Right.
He's saying, you know, you're the kind of guy who cheats and who underpays people, and you're just a bad person. And he's basically kind of talking like he's going to damage the reputation of the master. I mean, this guy turned quite mean.
Yes.
And so, no, why did he do that? The story doesn't portray the master as that kind of guy.
So I think that gets to the heart of the parable in a way, Paul, that I think this third servant represents a ton of people, even today, and how they view God. With fear, they view God as condemning, waiting to pounce on them. And so I think, I wish it was a bit more explicit in that way, but this third slave is so many people in the world and how they view God. Even if God has done nothing to condemn them, or it's what they've been taught about God.
Mhm.
And so I think that this, within the second half of the parable, it's the actions of the third slave that were motivated by fear and condemnation. And it's almost as if Matthew is saying that the God we face is the God we imagine, or the God that we trust. So if you think of God as a condemning bully, in your head, that's the God that you will face, even if that's not who God is. But if you trust the goodness of the master, then I think that's going to be the master, the way that the master then, comes to you. So I think there is something in there about our attitude toward God affects how we believe and the ability we have to trust in God.
I think it speaks too to the graciousness of God. The whole idea of forgiveness. That's something that I've had to live into, that we're forgiven over and over and over again by God, because it's hard to imagine that. And so the sense here, again, Paul, what you were saying, the very beginning, he's a gracious person because he gives to all of them. He doesn't make that distinction. But then, living into that fear, the third person does not realize that he's been freed to risk.
Mm-hmm.
See, we're all freed through Christ to risk sharing our talents. And when I say that, we're free to risk standing up for the disenfranchised. We're free to risk having a voice for those who don't have a voice. We're free to risk feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and being with those in prison. So we're free to risk that. The third person here didn't believe it. So we have to believe that forgiveness. The third person here didn't believe that forgiveness, and so it could not risk.
And buried the talent.
And buried the talent because of that.
Instead of freedom to double.
Exactly.
Or
exactly.
triple the gift.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think if he'd have even invested, like you said, you could have invested it and just given me the interest. Interest is not very good these days. So he could have invested it now and received nothing for it. I mean, nothing. I think the master would have still been okay with that because he did something. And this is all about not taking the risk, not recognizing the graciousness and the forgiveness of God to take the risk, to use your talent for good. Always to use your talent for good, whatever that is.
Well, that kind of speaks to me as a retiree, because when I started out, I was always encouraged to be like the 5-talent or the 2-talent guy, which is fine.
Yeah.
Strive. But now, as I get older, I can't be those kind of people. I'm moving towards the 1-talent kind of guy, and it makes me a little nervous because I'm getting closer to the guy who got in trouble. And it was somewhat comforting to realize that the cutoff point, the master actually set a fairly low standard for what he would tolerate before he kicked somebody out.
Yeah.
And for me, that means I can still do stuff that's pleasing to God, even though it's not as much as I used to be able to do.
Right. Well, and ultimately the parable isn't about economics and wealth. It is about how we live now, how we live today, what we do with the faith that we've been given, with our role in the kingdom of God that we've been given, how we utilize the gifts that have been given to us. It is about how we live now. And that gets lost, I think, in all the wealth, the language of wealth and kind of the economic implications of the text. But it's certainly about viewing the gift that we've been given as a gift of grace, and then using it, risking, believing that the master who gave it to us is good and loving. And I definitely think the third slave in the parable, it was obvious he did not view the master or the gift as good, but almost as a trap. And so I think it speaks to how we as humanity often view God. And in kind of a sad way, it's like holding a mirror up to us and saying, you don't know what I've given you. You missed the point. So,
you know, I'm not wise in all things money and investment, but I do know this: the longer that you have something invested, the better it is that you're going to come out with more money on top of that. So I want to look at verse 19 here, and I want to draw our attention to this, because we sometimes get the impression that the master left and came right back.
right.
But it says, after a long time, the master of those slaves returned. So we have to understand that too, that they were given, it wasn't, and I don't know, I believe they were not told when the master would return.
Right.
Obviously. They were not told when the master would return. And so what did they do? From day one, the third man was fearful. From day one. And couldn't risk. So all this time, after this long time, he finally goes back and digs up that talent to give back to the master. And it's like, all that time, you never went back and dug it up and thought, what could I do with this? Could I do something else with it?
Yeah.
But just burying it, put it out of sight and out of mind. And I think sometimes we do that too, is that it's been so long since Jesus died and was raised again and ascended, and so long that for the second coming that we get complacent. And I think that's what happened to the third person. We get complacent, so we bury our talents and just say, well, you know, he'll come again, but I still have that talent that I had. I just never used it for the good of the gospel.
I think I'd almost love to see like a modern day retelling of this parable, because I could kind of envision in my head a young child having some God-given talent. Maybe they're a wonderful pianist. Maybe they can paint beautifully, whatever it is. And you see, you know, in this modern day retelling, you would see the child grow up and get older and older and just bury that talent, not use that talent at all. And as the viewer, you know they have this beautiful gift that can better the world and better humanity, but they're not doing anything with it. And it's not even hoarding it. It's not even knowing what they have. It's being kind of oblivious to it, or not using it out of fear. And they get older and older and into adulthood, and it's as if, you know, God comes back in somehow and says, you haven't done anything with that gift. From age 4 till 25, you haven't done anything. You know, I think when we look at it through a different lens sometimes, we kind of get an understanding of why the master would have been like, you didn't do anything with the gift I gave you. You didn't use it at all. And I think that's at the heart of what the master must have felt. So. And
I'm going to use a word here also. It's not only that you didn't use the gift that I gave you, you ignored it. You buried it and then ignored it. Willfully ignored it.
You knew you had it. You may have not known how good it was.
Right.
And in this case, the guy was talking in a way that could damage the reputation of his master.
Yes. Yes.
I was thinking about, how could this apply to me? And my wife's a good cook. And she bought an inexpensive kitchen appliance that we could easily afford. And the engineer in me thought, that old appliance was perfectly good. But I'm trying, since we live 24/7 with each other, I'm trying to learn not to be overly critical, because she's a good cook, she's okay. And it's just sort of like this guy with one talent. Why should he more or less attack his boss?
Yes, yes. That's absolutely what he's doing. And I like what you said, he's trying to destroy his reputation.
Yeah.
And that's not, and that can seep into society. That little bit of rumor mongering, I guess, is what it is, because it's not true about the master. But what he's saying can easily be spread, and other people pick that up. Which would be difficult then for the master to enter into trade with other people, because now they may come to believe that he isn't honest and he isn't to be trusted. And there again, that's not true.
Yeah.
So that one person could damage the life of another.
Yeah.
Just by what he's saying.
I'd like to add too that if all we have is the end of this parable, if the Gospel of Matthew ended with, verse 30, we would conclude that God, even if God as the master did not begin as a harsh man, it kind of concludes on that note.
Absolutely.
And in the spirit of calling a thing what it is, I find that difficult. Most of us, even as
Absolutely.
pastors, find the casting out into darkness language difficult, but that's not how the Gospel of Matthew ends.
Right.
The Gospel of Matthew ends with God in human flesh, Jesus, dying for all of humanity.
Right.
Being scapegoated, being brutalized, being accused falsely, and staying silent on it to take the death that humanity would have taken. And so thankfully, and I think it's good to always kind of, even within the light of the parables, to keep in view that the God we know is a God who would die for us, who would go all the way to death to reconcile humanity back to God.
And it's also remembering what the purpose of a parable is. It's not to be taken literally. It's not to tear it apart. But Jesus used these parables to teach. And to teach the disciples, to teach the other people around them. So again, some of it goes back to Matthew's audience. And so Matthew would use these words to really motivate his audience. And Luke, Mark, and John, they would not use these words. These are not how their parables would end. So for Matthew, this is the way that Jesus would speak to share the gospel, to get people motivated to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Yes.
To kind of put that ultimatum on that.
Absolutely. And so I like what you said. It's always good to look at the end because, God wins. In the end, God wins. Even in the Gospel of Matthew, this is just how are we getting to that point.
Yeah, and Jesus wasn't his life was not really one of wrath. In the Thessalonians text, it says Jesus died for us.
Absolutely.
It reminds people that...
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm glad you brought in the epistle for this coming Sunday too, because we oftentimes need to see how they connect.
Right.
And what the parable may say may kind of leave out Paul's take on Jesus and what his life and ministry meant. So.
Well, my preaching professor, Paul Harms, would always say, if you read the text and it doesn't appear as if the gospel is there, bring it in. You know? And so,
I like that.
bring it in. And so, basically, Scott, you did that by saying, here's the end of the story. That there is good news. There is great good news. Even in Matthew, when sharing this. And while this may not appear to be good news, it really is good news.
It is.
And a reminder, as you said, Paul, that Jesus died for us. And the reminder is then, too, that as the master gave talents to all three people, Jesus died for everyone. Jesus died for everyone, and that's the good news.
Died for the ones who used their talents wisely and those who bury them and do nothing with them.
Yes.
So, yep, all are enveloped in that forgiveness.
And I think that's a good place for us to stop today on the good news that Jesus Christ died and was raised again for all of us. So again, we're pleased that you could be with us this morning. If you have any thoughts or questions, don't hesitate to email us or put them in the comments on YouTube, and we would be happy to get back with you. A few people have done that, and it's been wonderful to be in conversation with them. And so please do. Any last thoughts?
Thank you, Paul, for being with us
Yes,
today.
thank you, Paul.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right. Take care. Have a blessed day.